1962, director John Frankenheimer made The Manchurian Candidate, one of the all-time classic American political thrillers. Frank Sinatra as the hero, Angela Lansbury as the creepiest mother who's not in a horror movie, Lawrence Harvey as the brainwashed communist plant who's inserted into U.S. politics at the highest levels. It's one of the greatest American movies ever, as far as I'm concerned. The original, obviously, not the remake. 2 years after The Manchurian Candidate came out, the same director, John Frankenheimer, came out with 7 Days in May. This movie was made in 1964, but because it was thought of as dealing with such a sensitive subject, they actually set it in the future. They set it about a decade in the future, in the 1970s, to try to not freak people out quite so much about the plot that's in the movie potentially unfolding right then and there in the United States in the early 1960s. 7 Days in May is another classic, scary American political thriller. It's about the U.S. military rejecting civilian control of the military. The U.S. president in the movie, he signs a nuclear disarmament treaty with the Soviet Union, and the Senate ratifies it, and military leaders freak out and decide they disagree with that so strongly that the leaders of the U.S. military plan to launch a coup. And drama ensues. As Americans, we've got a great pantheon of these great, dark American political thrillers. These movies and books that simultaneously freak us out and also serve the constructive purpose of spelling out the kinds of outlandish dangers and threats we might, maybe, conceivably need to protect our country against someday. Right? At the very, very edges of our Constitution, at the very edges of what we might imagine is possible within U.S. history. Here's another, though, that I think ought to be thought of in the same breath as Manchurian Candidate and 7 Days in May. It's called Night of Camp David. It was actually written by the same guy who wrote 7 Days in May. That was the one about the military coup. Had John Frankenheimer made a movie based on this book, Night of Camp David, like he did with 7 Days in May, and like he did with Manchurian Candidate, Night at Camp David, I think, might be another one of those cultural touchstones we all now know about, even decades later. A movie that still entertains us, but also gives us a sort of cultural vocabulary for talking about what otherwise might be kind of hard to imagine threats that might someday arise around a U.S. presidency. In Night of Camp David, which is the book, not a movie, not nearly as well known, the serious problem that befalls the presidency and the country in that book is that the president goes nuts. An otherwise unremarkable senator from the president's own party figures out that the president is going nuts because the president repeatedly invites him up to Camp David for late-night chats at Camp David. And in those chats, the president very dramatically turns out all the lights and sits there in the dark. And he rants and raves, and he tells this senator all his destructive, secret, paranoid fantasies. He tells this senator his rather insane plans for the country and the world, some of which seem like they might not be things that the president's ruminating about. Some of these things the president has actually started to hint at and make mention of in public, but nobody's taking it too seriously yet, and the senator realizes, oh, wow, people better take this seriously. This is the book when it came out in paperback. Obviously, the big headline there, or the big title there, Night of Camp David. But if you look up at the top, you see the Grab the Reader subhead right at the top. What would happen if the president of the USA went stark raving mad? Well, it's fiction. I'm not going to tell you what happens. It does have a very snappy ending, I can promise you. But here's what the New York Times said in their book review when Night at Camp David came out in 1965. They said the portrayal of an apparently mentally incompetent president was, quote, a little too plausible for comfort. Our hero senator's, quote, dilemma, as he discovers when he tries to enlist the help of some elder statesman in Washington, is that the president turns out to be a borderline case in terms of his mental infirmity. The Times asks in their review, quote, at what point is the president's pathology obvious enough to justify action? And who gets to make the decision? Who does get to make the decision? Previously unimaginable things keep happening now. in our politics, in the White House specifically. And unprecedented behavior by a US president means literally and specifically that we don't know of any historical examples of any other president ever behaving this way, right? And that's not only to say that these things are remarkable, there's a practical consequence of these things being unprecedented. The practical consequence of the unprecedented nature of this presidency and this president's behavior is that history is no help to us. History is of no help. Court precedent is of no help in terms of us sorting out as a country the range of options we might reasonably have for how to respond to a situation like the one that we are in. History can't help us. Court precedent can't help us. Fiction, at least, can help us imagine it. Right? I mean, there's Frank Sinatra, the Manchurian Candidate, desperately trying to unprogram the Manchurian Candidate, to stop him from being a foreign agent, to try to unbrainwash him to save the country. In The Night of Camp David, it's our everyman senator trying to convince the wisest wise men he can find in Washington that something has to be done about the president increasingly going insane. He finds the upstanding Secretary of Defense. He goes to the senior congressional leaders of the president's own party, his own party. He goes to the president's White House physician. Can he convince them all? Is this the right group to try to convince? If he does convince this group, what outcome do they try to achieve and under what authority? Books like that, dystopian thriller books and movies like that, invite us as Americans to imagine what we might do with a presidency gone that haywire. Turns out, that all might have been good training, because today's news invites us Americans to consider the same. Quote, "The Times today is taking the rare step of publishing an anonymous op-ed essay. We have done so at the request of the author, a senior official in the Trump administration whose identity is known to us and whose job would be jeopardized by its disclosure. We believe publishing this essay anonymously is the only way to deliver an important perspective to our readers." And then this is the headline, which if past practice follows, is not something that would have been written by the author. It would have been written by the Times' editors. See the headline there, "I am part of the resistance inside the Trump administration." And then there's the subhead, quote, "I work for the president, but like-minded colleagues and I have vowed to thwart parts of his agenda and his worst inclinations." Like-minded colleagues and I. Who's I? The speculation all day today has been very fun, but honestly, we do not know. It's all speculation. If we believe the Times, it is a person serving in a senior role in the administration. It's a person who is currently in that job. It's not a former official. It's a current official. And whoever this person is, he or she has made the truly unnerving decision to stay in the White House as a senior administration official while also secretly notifying the public that the president of the United States is unfit to be president. And part of the reason this person is sounding that alarm anonymously rather than quitting in protest is because he or she believes that he or she needs to keep that White House job. So he or she can keep using that job to secretly undermine and sabotage the things the president is trying to do in an ongoing way to hurt the country. Yeah, happy Wednesday. I wish this was a novel. Quote, "President Trump is facing a test to his presidency unlike any faced by a modern American leader. The dilemma, which he does not fully grasp, is that many of the senior officials in his own administration are working diligently from within to frustrate parts of his agenda and his worst inclinations. I would know. I am one of them. Quote, to be clear, ours is not the popular resistance of the left. We want the administration to succeed and think that many of its policies have already made America safer and more prosperous. But we believe our first duty is to this country, and the president continues to act in a manner that is detrimental to the health of our republic. That is why many Trump appointees have vowed to do what we can to preserve our democratic institutions while thwarting Mr. Trump's more misguided impulses until he is out of office." So this is a currently serving administration official who's saying that he or she speaks for others, other senior people in the administration who have, quote, vowed to each other, like in an organized way, vowed to thwart the president's actions to save the country from him, because he continues to act in a manner that is detrimental to the health of our republic. And then we get this warning that is first about the dangerousness of the president's character, And second, about the dangerousness of what this senior administration official says is what the president wants for our country. Quote, "The root of the problem is the president's amorality. Anyone who works with him knows he is not moored to any discernible first principles that guide his decision-making. Although he was elected as a Republican, the president shows little affinity for ideals long espoused by conservatives, free minds, free markets, and free people." Quote, "In addition to his mass marketing of the notion that the press is the enemy of the people, President Trump's impulses are generally anti-trade and anti-democratic." Anti-democratic in this context does not mean the president is against the Democratic Party. It means he's against democracy. Quote, "In public and in private, President Trump shows a preference for autocrats and dictators," says a senior White House official. Quote, "From the White House to executive branch departments and agencies, senior officials will privately admit their daily disbelief at the commander-in-chief's comments and actions. Most are working to insulate their operations from his whims. Meetings with him veer off topic and off the rails. He engages in repetitive rants, and his impulsiveness results in half-baked, ill-informed, and occasionally reckless decisions that have to be walked back." The op-ed then describes the president as impetuous, adversarial, petty. It describes his behavior as, quote, "erratic." Since this was published this afternoon, there's been a lot of attention as to who the author of this might be, right? Understandably. A lot of speculation that maybe it's Mike Pence. Maybe it's the vice president. The vice president apparently really likes using the word lodestar in lots of his other prepared remarks. Same goes for the phrase cold comfort. Both of those phrases appear in this op-ed. So under that semi-mathematical reasoning, maybe it's the vice president or somebody who regularly writes remarks for the vice president. Or maybe it's White House counsel Don McGahn, who's on his way out the door and who we know has been talking to the special counsel at length and who we know has an uncanny way of getting his perspective into the newspaper without ever having his name explicitly on it. You will have noticed by now that Don McGahn is the hero of every story that mentions him, which usually tells you a little something about the sourcing of these stories. Don McGahn is supposed to be the engine behind the effort to get his friend Brett Kavanaugh onto the Supreme Court. If you think the Kavanaugh nomination started to crash and burn today with this litany of serious allegations that Kavanaugh may have lied under oath on multiple occasions the last time he was before the Senate, then maybe it's worth seeing this op-ed, which came out this afternoon, as a way to distract from Brett Kavanaugh's sinking fortunes. That said, if you think the Kavanaugh nomination is going well, then anyone hoping for him to get onto the court probably wasn't happy with this bombshell op-ed, since someone in the White House screaming that the president is off his rocker presumably will give at least some patriotic senators pause about doing anything irreversible on behalf of this particular president at this particular moment. It's also been discussed that it could be somebody in the White House communication shop or the White House press shop, since this whole operation with the New York Times today would have required some considerable savvy when it comes to dealing with the press. Maybe. We do not know who it is, honestly, and the speculation thus far is interesting, but it is just speculation. But here's something worth noting. At one point in the op-ed, this anonymous senior administration official turns reporter and stops giving his or her own take on the matter and instead quotes someone else. Quote, "There's literally no telling whether he might change his mind from one minute to the next. A top official complained to me recently," exasperated by an Oval Office meeting at which the president flip-flopped on a major policy decision he'd made only a week earlier. So this is the op-ed writer stopping just giving his or her own take and saying, here's something else that somebody told me in the White House coming out of a meeting with the president. If that's true, well, whichever top official in the White House recently said to another senior administration official, quote, "There is literally no telling whether he might change his mind from one minute to the next." The person who said that knows they said it, and they know to whom they said it. And so, if this anonymous op-ed writer is telling the truth here about that interaction, that top official who uttered this quote knows who wrote the op-ed. But for all the attention on trying to figure out who the op-ed writer is, and the White House going off like a Roman candle tonight, calling this treason and saying that the Times, under national security grounds, has to hand over the identity of this person to the government. For all the attention as to who this was, This op-ed writer, again, does not purport to be acting alone here. Quite the contrary, right? Like-minded colleagues and I. Many Trump appointees have vowed to do what we can. Many of the senior officials in his own administration are working from within to frustrate parts of his agenda and worst inclinations. Some of his aides have gone to great lengths to keep bad decisions contained to the West Wing. All the focus on who the author of this might be ignores the fact that this op-ed purports to be from, effectively, the spokesperson for a group within the White House. A group that wants to be seen as unsung heroes. Right? Quote, "It may be cold comfort in this chaotic era, but Americans should know there are adults in the room. We fully recognize what is happening, and we are trying to do what's right, even when Donald Trump won't." A few possibilities here. It is always possible that the Times is getting hoaxed here, right? Not at all likely, but possible. Halloween comes early this year, boo, right? Here comes the cold, bony fingers of insanity and authoritarianism to grab your ankle when your foot drifts off the bed. Ha ha, it's a hoax. It's possible that this is just the Times, somebody pulling a trick on the Times. It's also possible the Times is getting played by the White House here. That maybe this is, I don't know, a White House-endorsed effort to make the president seem so besieged from within that it justifies extreme action by the president to clean house and fire lots and lots of people without too much scrutiny on any one of those firings. But, there's no reason to think that either of those things is what's happened. There's no reason to expect that the Times would have done anything other than their best due diligence on this in terms of figuring out the origins of this and not getting played, not getting hoaxed. There's every reason to think this is what it appears to be. And if it is what it appears to be, if this really is a real senior administration official speaking for a group within the White House that feels the need to sound this alarm about what is wrong with the serving president, why are they making this public case now? And what exactly are they trying to get us, the public, to do about it? Right? You can snipe these sort of comments, in gossip. You can make these sort of plans and plots among your fellow co-conspirators in the White House if you're actively working to sabotage the president's worst impulses and thwart him from the worst things he wants to do to the country. You can do all that without signaling to the public, hey, op-ed on the New York Times. You need to know this is happening. Why signal it to the public? What are they asking of the public here? And I ask that specifically because this op-ed has a little bit of a false ending. This is the end of it. This is the part that looks like it's supposed to be the ending. Quote, "There is a quiet resistance within the administration of people choosing to put country first. But the real difference will be made by everyday citizens, rising above politics, reaching across the aisle, and resolving to shed the labels in favor of a single one, Americans." And that is very nice. Let us all be Americans again, Americans first. Let's come together. That is definitely the way that a nimble politician would end any op-ed, no matter the topic. Right? Unimpeachably solid sentiment there. But what's the instruction there, really? What's the, hey, public, you need to know to do this. Hey, public, you need to know this is happening. We're sounding the alarm here. Here's what you do. That closing is maybe a sort of notice to the president's supporters that they should stop blindly supporting him, that even the president's own officials within the White House say he's not worthy of support. If that's the message here of this op-ed, then honestly, the New York Times op-ed page was an odd choice to deliver that message to Trump supporters. And given the sort of soft nature of this ending, what ought to have been a real clarion message here ended up, frankly, a little bit hard to make out. That's why I say this appears to be sort of a false ending to this piece. Here's the real one. Quote, "Given the instability many witnessed, there were early whispers within the cabinet of invoking the 25th Amendment, which would start a complex process for removing the president. But no one wanted to precipitate a constitutional crisis. So we will do what we can to steer the administration in the right direction until, one way or another, it's over." Until one way or another, it's over. 25th Amendment to the Constitution, as everybody and their mother Googled today, we all now know, came into effect in 1967 after the assassination of President John F. Kennedy to clarify the exact procedures for handling the line of succession in the case of the president becoming unable to fulfill the duties of the presidency. And there's more to it than just that summary, but the first line of Section 4 of the 25th Amendment spells out that in that instance, the vice president and a majority of the cabinet would notify the House and Senate that the president is unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. And with the Senate and the House so notified, the vice president would then assume the powers and duties of the office as acting president. And it gets more complicated from there, but the basic idea is that if the vice president and the cabinet have enough unanimity on the subject of the president's inability to continue to serve as president, and no, there's no case law, there's no historical precedent establishing exactly what that threshold might look like, but if they all got there together, theoretically, the 25th Amendment might be useful for removing President Trump from the office of the presidency from within, at least temporarily. Is that what they're telling us needs to be done here? Or what they're telling us is going to be done here? In the Michael Wolff book, Fire and Fury, that came out early this year, Steve Bannon is quoted twice invoking the 25th Amendment when it comes to President Trump. Quote, Spicer, Priebus, Cohn, Gary Cohn, Powell, Bannon, Tillerson, Mattis, Mnuchin, virtually the entire senior staff and cabinet of the Trump presidency had traveled through the stages of adventure, challenge, frustration, battle, self-justification, and doubt before finally having to confront the very real likelihood that the president they worked for did not have the wherewithal to adequately function in his job. The debate, as Steve Bannon put it, was not about whether the president's situation was bad, but whether it was 25th Amendment bad. Then a few pages later in the book, toward the end of the book, Bannon is quoted again, predicting that there is a 1/3 chance that Trump would, quote, limp to the end of his term, a 1/3 chance that the Mueller investigation would lead to the impeachment of the president, and a 1/3 chance, quote, that Trump would resign, perhaps in the wake of a threat by the cabinet to act on the 25th Amendment, by which the cabinet can remove a president in the event of his incapacitation. So maybe we should have seen this coming, right? That book, with warnings about the president being removed from office this way, that book came out at the very start of the year in January. Since then, we got the first book from a former senior advisor to the president. She chose as the title of her book the word unhinged, and she was not talking about herself. Now, we are about to get the new book from Bob Woodward. It's not technically out yet, but we know from people getting advanced copies of the book that it details, among other things, senior officials stealing documents from the president's desk to keep him from seeing them. And even the military just flat out pretending like he's not ordering things that he is absolutely trying to order, up to and including the assassination of foreign leaders. The military is saying, yes, sir, right away, sir, we'll get right on that, and then just not doing it. And that might make you root for the military in this instance, right? Thank God they're not following insane orders from this president. But, oh boy, is that a dangerous thing to break. There's a reason why the U.S. military not answering to civilian leadership anymore is the stuff of dystopian novels and movies, like 7 Days in May. Those kinds of things make it into political thrillers because the thrill there is that they're supposed to scare us. In this case today, this isn't 7 Days in May. This is more of a touch of Night of Camp David. Someone in the White House is trying to warn the country that the president is nuts and unfit, and the senior people who work around him know it. And the end is near, maybe in the form of the invocation of the 25th Amendment by the Vice President of the United States and a majority of the president's cabinet. If this is what it appears to be, if this is true, then one, hey, this is a remarkable time for the Senate to rush ahead to try to install a nominee from this president on the Supreme Court as a lifetime appointment. Two, if they're not too busy trying to move ahead with the president's nominee for this lifetime appointment, then hey, maybe this is something the Congress might want to look into. As of today, a senior White House official says members of the president's cabinet have discussed invoking the 25th Amendment to remove the president from office on the basis of the fact that they believe he's unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office. They only held back because of worries that removing him might cause a, quote, crisis. Well, now something has happened since then that has this senior administration official warning the public that even though they elected not to do this before, the public should start thinking of this now as an option moving forward. That might seem like the kind of thing that Congress would want to look into. And of course, the unavoidable last question here is, what has this set in motion?